AMD somewhat secretly launched the CPU we're reviewing today, which is the Ryzen 5 7600X3D. It's a new X3D part, Zen 4, 6 cores, 12 threads, and it is $300. So this is a CPU we bought from Micro Center in Charlotte. They mailed it up to us. And AMD did not email us, or as far as we know, really anybody about the CPU. There was no media activity. They didn't do any press events, press briefings, or press sampling for reviews. So it just sort of quietly launched out to the market. And we had viewers ask a couple weeks ago why we hadn't reviewed it. And the answer was, we didn't know it existed. Now we have one though. So this is similar to the 5600X3D launch in that way. This runs on Zen 4. It's advertised as having a maximum 4.7 gigahertz boost clock and 4.1 base. TDP is listed as 65 watts. AMD's 7600X has a higher TDP at 105 watts and runs an advertised max clock of 5.3 gigahertz or 4.7 base. That'd make the 7600X better in some very specific frequency constraint scenarios which can't utilize the extra cache, like in our non-gaming test. But it'll also make it more power hungry, and having the extra cache normally allows better performance in gaming even if the frequency is lower, and it tends to be more efficient. That'd make the 7600 in some ways more of a direct comparison by TDP, which that one is also 65 watts. So 7600X2D was a bit of a surprise to us. We're reviewing it today following our 9800X2D review, and it ended up being one of the most efficient CPUs we've tested because of its combination of lower TDP, so the lower power budget, which is constrained by AMD, and the X3D additional cache. Let's get into the review. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace, and visiting squarespace.com/gamersnexus will give you 10% off your first purchase with them. We've built a number of our own websites with Squarespace, where we list catastrophic PC hardware failures to inform subscribers of those failures. We also built our store website with Squarespace using its built-in e-commerce tools, and of course, we built a website for our CEO, Snowflake, because she demanded our audience know who really runs the show. Get to the core of your idea and spend less time on web design by signing up at squarespace.com/gamersnexus or click the link below. So technically, the CPU is another Micro Center exclusive like the 5600X3D. We're not sure if that'll change. We don't know if they'll open it up to a wider market, if they'll do any official shipping or anything like that, or how many they have. But getting into the pricing first. So currently, the 7600X non-3D is $224 on Newegg, $208 on Amazon at the time we're writing this anyway. It's $190 from Micro Center, which is probably the more like-for-like comparison to the $300 76X3D because you'd have to buy it there. Other relevant parts include the 7800X3D at 8 cores and 16 threads, priced at $480 or so. On Amazon, $450 on Micro Center's site. Between the two, it's $150 to $180 more expensive to get the R7 7800X3D or the new 9800X3D, which is $480. Than the 7600X3D R5. Intel's most relevant modern competition might include the $320 245K, which is their Ultra 5 line. Again, you can think of that like maybe a 15600K or something. It also has the $350 14700K, $344 13700K, or oddly, the 12900K, which is an i9 CPU, at $277, which is from Intel's best architecture right now, Alder Lake, because it didn't have the problems that we don't need to go over again right this minute. But at $277, it's been as low as like 120 or something from Best Buy. That CPU is actually oddly still relevant right now, though, although we wouldn't recommend buying into a platform that's basically done, well, is done at this point, but it is something to pay attention to. So today's review is going to be kept as simple as possible. We're not going to go as crazy in depth as in the 9800X3D review, just letting you know, all know up in advance. We just launched a massive 38-minute deep dive of the 9800X3D, so if you want extra charts with more discussion of the components on it, then you should check that review for all of that. This is, however, just adding the 76X3D and just coming off of all that hard work. We wanted something a little simpler and straightforward to do, and this one's pretty straightforward. So check out the 98X3D link below if you want the rest. But for now, let's get into a review of the new 7600X3D, which is, again, $300. So we'll be comparing it to some other $300-ish CPUs. We'll start with a frequency inspection to understand the performance we see later. Here's an all-core workload. The 9800X3D we just reviewed ran at about 5225 MHz average, which is an impressive clock to hold for a 3D cache part. It's also a flat hold of the frequency thanks to the extra power budget. The 7800X3D fluctuates more due to the power constraint, holding around 4850 MHz on average. The 7600X3D comes in below that at 4700 to 4730 MHz, also moving up and down through the test. For perspective, the 7600X non-3D part ran at about the same clock as the 9800X3D, up around 5225 MHz. If you see the 7600X outperform the 7600X3D in some tests, that won't be a surprise. Anything which relies on the cache less than on the higher clocks will see a regression in performance. This is less prevalent on Zen 5 with the 9800X3D due to the higher power budget and because the 9700X had a lower power budget, but it's common on the 7000 and the 5000 series. This chart is for the maximum single core boost during a Cinebench single threaded workload. This allows us to see how fast the cores go when unlikely to breach power limits. The 9800X3D we just reviewed held the same 5225 MHz clock that we saw in all-core testing and did so throughout the benchmark. The 7800X3D ran faster than its all-core workload, which is more typical. That had it at 5050 MHz during this test on the fastest core per interval. The 7600X3D is far slower than that, with a comparatively huge drop to 4750 MHz for the fastest single core per interval. That's a large reduction that'll likely contribute to losses in certain titles, maybe like Final Fantasy, more than the core count difference between the 78 and the 76 would. The 7600X ran at 5450 MHz for the fastest single core, which will also benefit it in lightly threaded scenarios versus the X3D part in situations where the extra cache doesn't contribute much. Let's move on to some gaming benchmarks. For gaming efficiency first, we were impressed with the 7600X3D's efficient performance in Baldur's Gate 3. It's the new most efficient CPU in our testing here. Our efficiency benchmarks are a combination of both power drawn during the test and the performance output in the test, which is FPS in this situation. Tweaking either of those two dials can improve efficiency since it's a calculation of the two. The 7600X3D ended up at 42.8 watts in this test, which has it reduced from the 5700X3D, the 5800X3D, and the 7800X3D. It's among the lowest power draw parts in this test, alongside others like the R7 2700. With the 12-watt reduction from the 7800X3D, and with performance similar to the 5700X3D, the 7600X3D ends up at 2.7 FPS per watt, which is an awesome result that we didn't expect to see. The 9800X3D is alongside it at the top, roughly tied with the 7800X3D at 2.3 to 2.4 FPS per watt. This is a strong start. And for the 7600 non-X3D, that landed at 1.6 FPS per watt, which puts it above the 5600X, below the 5800X3D, and predictably above the 7600X. But it's still below the 7600X3D. Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail also has insanely efficient performance. The CPU is, once again, not the best performer on the charts, but it encroaches on the top and manages to do so while at 34 watts during this benchmark. Because the power is so much lower overall, the efficiency climbs, despite a reduction in max FPS versus better AMD parts. The end result is a 10.3 FPS per watt rating, the highest we've seen, against 8.3 FPS per watt on the 7800X3D. The 7800X3D is reaching the upper bound of what it can achieve for performance. It's possible that this number increases with the launch of the 5090, but for now it's stuck at 8.3 FPS per watt. The 7600X original part pulls a little more power and performs far worse, landing it down at 5.6 FPS per watt. Still ahead of anything Intel has to offer, including the 245K at 4.3, but nowhere close to the 7600X3D. In Stellaris, the 7600X3D required 33.1 seconds to complete the simulation. This reduces the time required from the 7600X's 36-second entry by 8%. The 9600X from Zen 5 outperforms the 7600X3D and benefits from the overall Zen 5 uplift we've seen in this specific game. It's pretty consistent now. Aside from that, everything else above the 7600X3D is significantly more expensive. That includes the 285K at $630, but only providing a 1.8% reduction in time required to simulate. Against the 5700X3D, the 7600X3D sees a 14% reduction in time required. The same is true compared to the 5600X3D. The new 9800X3D is aided hugely by its architecture and frequency, requiring 22% less time than the 7600X3D. The 7800X3D benefits from a 5.4% reduction in time required, and overall, the 7600X3D encroaches on the 78X3D in this game while running significantly lower cost, but it can't come close to the 9800X3D. Now, we don't have the 7600 non-X tested for everything today. We have it in a couple charts though. This is one of them. So in this one, it was at 36.9 seconds. Predictably, it's worse than the 7600X, but the gap between them, as we saw in our original review of the 7600 non-X, is pretty small in most situations. So wherever we're missing the 7600, you can take a look at the 7600X, estimate very slightly below that, and you get kind of where it lands. Dragon's Dogma 2 is up now. This is another title where the 9800X3D saw strong performance in yesterday's review. For this game, the 9800X3D holds a 21% lead over the 7600X3D in average FPS at about 129 FPS to 106. The lows are proportional to the increase in average FPS. There's no particularly abnormal advantage to those found on the 9800X3D. They're still good. It's just, it makes sense considering the average is up too. Compared to the 5700X3D's 103 FPS average, the 7600X3D holds a small 3.1% lead. It's 3.5% ahead of the prior generation 5600X3D, which was also a Micro Center exclusive. As for Intel, key comparisons include the 245K at 95 FPS average and priced similarly to the 7600X3D. This gives the 76X3D a 12% advantage in average FPS over the new 245K, with the lows again proportionally higher. The i7 and i9 CPUs from the 13th and 14th series are all roughly tied with the 76X3D, but slightly ahead. The 5800X3D maintains its position at the top of this grouping, although it is beaten by the newer CPUs. Starfield is up now. This was another strong one for the 9800X3D in the review we ran. In this one, the 7600X3D ran at 122 FPS average. That means the 9800X3D's 169 FPS result has it about 38% ahead of the 7600X3D, which is a significant jaunt. The 7800X3D ran at 145 FPS average, offering its own improvement of 19% over the 7600X3D. The 7600X3D is definitely a lower-end part than the two flagships, shows through in this game. Compared to the 5700X3D, though, the 76 is technically improved, though basically within error at 3.2% uplift. The 5600X3D gives the 7600X3D a lead of 8.2%, widening the gap in favor of the newer Micro Center part. Intel's showing includes the 245K at about the same frame rate and a similar price. It has the 12900K at a higher frame rate, and it has the 13600K also ahead. The 7600X3D is stunted by a combination of its lower core count and its frequency, and it's not able to leverage the cache to the same extent as the higher-end AMD X3D parts. It does, however, still leverage it, though. If you look at the 76X3D versus the 7600X, the uplift there is about 20%, the previous one being at around 102 FPS average for the non-3D variant. In Baldur's Gate 3, the 9800X3D experienced a large performance boost that we spent several minutes digging into in its review. It was an outlier. The 7600X3D is more typical. It ran the game at 116 FPS average, which allows the 9800X3D another 38% lead. The lows remain impressive on the 9800X3D, followed by the prior 13 series CPUs and 14 series as the next most impressive for lows. The 7600X3D is overall fine in this category, but its position is predictable within the stack. The 7800X3D posted a 126 FPS average result in Baldur's Gate, giving it a boost of 9% for the extra $180 or so. It doesn't seem worth it if you have a Micro Center near you. The 5700X3D remains pretty close as well, with a 111 FPS average that would be indistinguishable more or less from the result of the 7600X3D. The 5700X3D also benefits from a fiercely competitive price, just knowing that it's on AM4 still. The 245K from Intel slips down this chart, especially with Windows 24H2. It's at 93 FPS average, giving the 7600X3D a 25% lead in average FPS. Lows are about the same. Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail is next. This one has the 7600X3D at 349 FPS average, with lows at 164 and 79. That positions it roughly tied with the 7800X3D, both of which appear to be encountering similar limits. The 9800X3D managed to break free of this bind and post a 373 FPS result. It's good, but it's not as impressive as we saw in other tests. But this isn't meant to be another review of the 9800X3D. We have 40 minutes of that on the channel already. The 7600X3D boosts over the 7600X's 259 FPS average by 35%, leading the 259 FPS entry by a significant margin. X3D in general completely divides this chart, forming a rift below the 5600 X3D and everything else. Intel's closest competitor on this chart is the 14900K and things that are in proximity, although it's more expensive. It's up at 310 FPS average. The 7600 X3D leads even the former Intel i9 flagship by 13%. Its lead over the 5700 X3D is noteworthy at 16%. This is because the 5700 X3D is dropping clocks, which we know to impact its Final Fantasy performance. It's also why the 5600 X3D runs higher in performance. Its clocks are typically at least 300 MHz higher. This is something that Final Fantasy favors more than the extra 2 cores. Remember, it's not as simple as just product name bigger, therefore better. This behavior has existed in Final Fantasy basically since we started testing it. Rainbow Six Siege is up now. In this one, the 7600 X3D ran at 613 FPS average. 613.3 FPS average. That 0.3 is important because elite FPS gamers can see even the difference between 0.000798 milliseconds. The 613.3 FPS result has it up alongside the 9600X and below the 9700X. The 7800 X3D ran at 622 FPS average. Sorry, again, that's 622.1, which means it holds a 1.4% lead. It's basically error. These CPUs are functionally the same, with lows differentiated only by how wildly variable this particular game is. As for the 5700 X3D, the lead from the 7600 X3D is a more noteworthy 17%. There's also a big jump over the 245K, way down at 476 FPS average. Generally, though, the top CPUs are mostly the same. The 9800 X3D is boosted, but not in a huge way, like in some other games. We're up against the limits. In F124, the 7600 X3D ran at about 409 FPS average and was flanked by the 5800 X3D and 7800 X3D. The 7800 X3D holds a 7.2% lead in average FPS, with a big jump in the 1% and 0.1% lows. Both are ultimately completely acceptable. The 5800 X3D's 391 FPS average gave up a 4.4% lead to the 7600 X3D. The gap against the 7600X non-3D is massive here at 409 FPS to 312, or a 31% uplift for the 7600 X3D. That's a big climb when considering the frequency and cache changes discussed earlier. Intel's 245K is far down the chart, more similar to the 7600X than the newer X3D variant. The 14900K is closer, but still behind at 385 FPS average. In Total War Warhammer 3, the 7600 X3D ran at 484 FPS average. That has it in the top grouping again, but technically behind the 14700K. Realistically, in average FPS, they're the same. However, the X3D CPUs all have large advantages in frame time consistency and pacing, as illustrated by the 1% and 0.1% lows. The 9800 X3D and 7800 X3D are both encountering external limits otherwise. Now, the real takeaway is that Intel continues to get bodied by X3D, although in this case there's a game component to it as well. The 265K and 285K both suffer from the same impact we saw to the 14900K and 13900K, where frame time consistency plummets and large frame time spikes pop up more frequently. This affects the averaging as well, since it drags everything down, which leads to the 285K and 265K seeming to perform worse than a lower thread count 245K. This is a repeatable result. Even the DDR5 8600 285K entry has worse lows than the 245K, and that's all because of scheduling. There are community mods to try and help with this, but we test games as the developers ship and maintain them. Production workloads are not a big focus for R5 CPUs, so we'll fly through these and hit a few basics. In Blender 3D rendering on the CPU, the 7600 X3D required 21.3 minutes to complete a frame of the GN intro animation. This is one of the slower results, putting it in line with the 5700 X3D, the 3700X, and the 5800X. The 7600X itself is faster than the 7600 X3D, which is not a new or unexpected behavior. While the 9800 X3D actually outperformed the 9700X, generally speaking, X3D CPUs are worse in production-heavy all-core tasks than the CPUs that they functionally stack the cache on top of. That's because the frequency comes down on prior generations, mostly for thermal budget reasons, and this is also why Zen 5 X3D is so interesting. So, for the 7600 X3D, we're back to a situation where it typically make more sense to buy any other CPU on the chart, above it anyway, for heavy workstation use cases that we test. If you're building a machine that's gaming focused first and foremost, then the 7600 X3D should still be in consideration. It's capable of handling production style work on the side, but there are better options for a build more purely focused on that kind of work. The 7600X3D is beaten by the 12600K, the 5800X, and many other CPUs. Blender scales cleanly with thread count, and that shows here. The 285K is also relatively competitive in this particular test, as are the 265K and sort of the 245K. In Chromium Code Compile, the 7600X3D required 208 minutes to complete the compile. That has it way down the chart and near the 5800X and 5800X3D. The 7600X3D is struggling with its thread deficit and just wasn't built to excel at the production applications we test with. Even the 3700X isn't distant from it. The 7600X benefits from a time reduction to 198 minutes in this test, with the 9600X and 12600K ahead of that. In 7-zip file compression, the 7600X3D ended up completing about 87,000 MIPS, putting it ahead of the 3700X and behind the 5700X3D. The 7600X is again better at 91,000 MIPS, or improved by 5.2%. As with other pre-Zen 5 X3D parts, if doing this kind of work heavily, it'd make more sense to buy something else. The part is acceptable for its price if gaming is the primary focus. Decompression is similar. The 3700X outmatches the 7600X3D marginally. The 7600X3D is just ahead of the 12600K now, and the 7600X non-3D runs 8.8% faster. The 9800X3D stood out here as improving on the 9700X again. It remains benefited by its higher power budget that enables higher boosting. We covered this in the review. The 16-core parts like the 9950X and 7950X have a major advantage in this workload that the 7600X3D can't unlock with a 6-core configuration. Adobe Premiere is tested with the Puget suite using a mix of raw performance, intra-frame effects, and processing analysis. The result is in aggregate points. The 7600X3D scored 7832 points, which has the 7600X ahead of it by 4.2% at 8159. Next above that is the 12600K. The 245K posts a significant gain over the 7600X3D here as well. Against prior parts, the 7600X3D at least improves upon the 5700X3D and 56X3D components in a more noticeable way. It's just not impressive on its own. In Adobe Photoshop and tested with Puget, again, the 7600X3D fell down the charts to 14600K levels of performance and functionally tied the 245K. It's an okay spot to be in, but AMD dominates the top half of this chart with other components, including the 7600X. The reason for this drop comes down to the loss in frequency, which is important to Photoshop in its current iteration with this test. So wrapping this all up, it's pretty simple. On the positives, the efficiency on the 7600X3D is actually kind of crazy. Extremely good performance from an efficiency standpoint. Now, most people, especially in this price class, tend to not really be as worried about pure efficiency. You might care about power consumption or something like that. But when we're talking efficiency, you can have parts that draw similar power to it ultimately, but just produce a worse efficiency number because the performance is maybe a little lower or something. So the reason these Zen 4 X3D parts specifically do pretty well in this category is because they are power constrained, which is because of the thermal concerns that AMD had with the prior X3D parts. We talked about all that on the Zen 5 stuff, but short version, AMD re-architected Zen 5 ground up to accommodate X3D, which allows them to get the core complexes at the top rather than the bottom, which helps them with some of the thermal constraints, allows them to lift that power budget limit and boost the clocks more at a higher power, and therefore it would be a little bit past the peak sort of optimal point on the efficiency curve, the VF curve. So the 7600X3D still hits that optimal point more or less, and it does well for efficiency. It's just that most people don't buy on efficiency in this price class. So if we look at the raw, pure performance standpoint, we get the expected Zen 4 behaviors. The 7600X3D is definitely superior to the 7600X, or 7600 of course, which is just a lower performance 7600X. When looking at gaming scenarios, it is worse than the 7600X in non-gaming scenarios that we test for the most part right now anyway. And that's just because the clock's come down, it's got less power budget to boost, and the extra cache doesn't really help in the applications we test outside of gaming. So that's why that shakes up the way it does. Because an R5, like an Ultra 5, is targeted at gaming though, that's going to be our key focus for this sort of final analysis. So performance achieves most of what a 7800X3D can offer, but it is $150 to $180 less expensive. The 9800X3D is, in some cases, significantly higher in performance. We're seeing like 30+% in a few instances, depending on how unbound or unconstrained it was. And in those scenarios, the 9800X3D offers a meaningful uplift. It's just that price jump is pretty big. So if you are buying on a stricter budget and going from 300 to say 480 is either not possible or would take money from elsewhere in the budget, let's take that second scenario. If it takes money from elsewhere, that money probably better goes towards a GPU to unlock more performance in most gaming scenarios, unless you have a heavier mixture of non-gaming applications, but you're still kind of gaming first. There's a lot of caveats in there. The 7600 X3D's biggest strength is definitely the efficiency. The gaming is pretty good. It does achieve most of other X3D gaming. Its biggest weakness is that core count, where in the games we test, the cache makes up for the core deficit most of the time. It doesn't really hurt it. But in non-gaming scenarios, if you regularly do stuff outside of gaming tasks, like say rendering intensive applications, stuff like Adobe Premiere might utilize the extra cores in some situations. Those scenarios are where you'd notice the deficit from the 76X3D. If that doesn't sound like something you're too concerned about, or you don't do a lot of those things outside of play games and use the internet, then the 6 cores, 12 threads is fine here with the extra cache. The quick version is for users who are more work intensive. We'd say look at other CPUs. Even in this price class, they're going to be better for you, especially if you look at our Blender charts, Chromium charts, 7-zip compression, decompression, stuff like that. There are way better options at this price point from both Intel and AMD. And then if you're gaming focused, then the 7600X3D makes sense at $300 if you can't stretch up to something else, or you want to leave money available for a GPU. And of course, the biggest downside here is micro-center exclusivity. So if it pops up somewhere else, great. But if not, then it's out of our control. So I guess go, I don't know, yell at AMD or something. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Check out the 9800X3D review if you want all the sort of usual depth and the extra charts we did researching that CPU. Is really fun, very interesting part, and that's on the channel. Otherwise, check back for more, subscribe. You can get our new dice sets for tabletop gaming like Magic, D&D, and other games on store.gamersnexus.net. It directly supports us and funds our testing efforts, and they're pretty cool. The inductor dice use the e-waste inductors in the resin sharp edge dice, and the snowflake dice have a perfectly modeled caricature of my cat and GN CEO Snowflake. We'll see you all next time.